A monopoly is one firm in an industry selling a product for which there are no close substitutes. A monopoly exists because of barriers to entry. Barriers to entry is anything that prevents firms from entering a market. Monopolies also exist because of market power. Market power is a firm's power to set its price without losing its entire share of the market. Monopolies are price makers. A firm that has the power to set its price rather than taking the price set by the market. A price maker is the opposite of a price taker. There are two major differences between a monopoly and competition. Difference number one, there is no one to undercut a monopolist's price. In a monopoly, there's only one seller. If that seller chooses to sell at a higher price, it does not need to worry about being undercut by other sellers. Difference number two, impact of quantity decisions on the price. In a competitive market, if a firm increases or decreases the quantity that it will sell, it has very little or no effect on the price, because each competitive firm is small relative to the market. In a monopoly, a decrease or an increase in the firm's quantity will have an effect on the equilibrium price in the market because it is the only seller. From this graph, graphically illustrates the contrasting market power of a monopoly and a competitive firm. The demand curve faced by a monopoly is downward sloping, showing that a change in quantity will change prices. This is illustrated by the graph on the left. Note that the demand curve of a monopoly is the same as the market demand curve. The demand curve faced by a competitive firm is horizontal, implying that a change in quantity will have no effect on prices. This is illustrated by the graph on the right. From before, we learned that for a competitive firm, the marginal revenue or the additional revenue that the firm gets from selling one more unit equals the price of the good. The competitive firm's demand curve, represented by the graph on the right, is also the firm's marginal revenue curve. For monopoly, marginal revenue equals price does not hold, because the firm faces a downward sloping demand curve. If the firm charges a single price to all its customers, then a decision to sell one more unit will require that the firm must decrease the price of all the units that the firm will try to sell. As a result, the marginal revenue of a monopoly will be lower than the price of the good. This is best illustrated by this table. The first two columns on this table represent the market demand curve, where increases in quantity correspond to lower prices. The third column calculates the total revenue that the firm generates by selling each quantity. Recall that total revenue is calculated by multiplying the price of the good with the quantity of the goods sold. Thus, total revenue equals price times quantity. The fourth column shows the marginal revenue brought about the quantity sold. Remember that marginal revenue is equal to the change in total revenue over the change in quantity. Note that the value of the marginal revenue, the fourth column, is consistently lower than the price of the good, the second column, once the quantity is higher than 1. Further, the marginal revenue drops 2 times faster than the price as quantity is increased. This graph illustrates the relationship between total revenue, marginal revenue, and demand faced by a monopoly. The graph on the left shows the total revenue curve of the monopoly. Notice that unlike the total revenue curve faced by the competitive firm, the total revenue curve of a monopoly is not a straight line, and the curve becomes flatter as the quantity sold increases. Since the slope of the total revenue curve is the marginal revenue, the curve shows that the marginal revenue of the monopoly increases as quantity increases. Further, since the total revenue slopes downward after the quantity equals 8, it implies that the marginal revenue of a monopoly can be negative. The graph on the right shows 3 major points. 1. The marginal revenue of a monopoly is a straight line that lies below the demand curve. 2. The marginal revenue curve is steeper than the demand curve. In fact, it's 2 times steeper. And 3. The marginal revenue curve can be negative. When a monopoly raises output, the effect of the increase in quantity on total revenue is twofold. 1. A positive effect, since one more additional unit is sold. 2. A negative effect, since selling one more item forces the firm to lower prices. The positive effect of an increase in output is represented with the blue rectangle in this graph. The negative effect of a decrease in output is represented with the red rectangle. The net effect of an increase in output on marginal revenue depends on the sizes of the positive, blue effect, and the negative, the red effect. If the positive effect, or the blue rectangle, is larger than the negative effect, or the red rectangle, then an increase in output results in a larger total revenue, and the marginal revenue is positive. If the positive effect, or the blue rectangle, is smaller than the negative effect, or the red rectangle, then an increase in output results in a smaller total revenue, and the marginal revenue is negative. Since the average revenue is declining, it must be true that the marginal revenue is lower than the average revenue. Hence, as illustrated, the marginal revenue curve must lie below the average revenue or demand curve. Recall, profits are the total revenue received from selling the product minus the total cost of producing the product, or profits is equal to total revenue minus total cost. One way to find out profit is to plot a firm's total revenue and total cost curves, with dollars on the y-axis and quantity on the x-axis. This is shown in this graph. The profit maximizing quantity is the point when the distance between total revenue and total cost is maximized, and total revenue is greater than total cost. Note, if total revenue is less than total cost, then profit maximization requires the distance between total revenue and total cost to be minimized. In this figure, any quantity to the left, a lower quantity, or to the right, a higher quantity, of the profit maximizing quantity will result in a lower profit. The graph on the right of this figure illustrates this point. One characteristic of the profit maximizing level of quantity is that the slopes of the total revenue and the slope of the total cost curves are the same. Since the slope of the total revenue curve is the marginal revenue and the slope of the total cost curve is the marginal cost, then profit maximization requires that marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Notice that the rule for finding the profit maximizing output for a monopoly is the same as in a competitive market. In both markets, the rule for profit maximization is MR equals MC. This figure graphically compares and contrasts profit maximization in a competitive market and in a monopoly. In this figure, we can see that the difference in profit maximization for a monopoly and a competitive firm lies only in the shape of the total revenue curve. In a competitive firm, the total revenue curve is linear. In a monopoly, the total revenue curve has a much steeper slope. In this figure, both the competitive firm and the monopoly find the profit maximizing output by equating marginal revenue with marginal cost. This figure shows the generic diagram of how to determine profits of a monopoly. To determine the profits and the profit maximizing quantity of a monopoly, we need to follow these steps. Step 1. Find the intersection of the marginal revenue curve and the marginal cost. This is the profit maximizing rule. Step 2. The quantity coordinate of the intersection between marginal revenue and marginal cost is the profit maximizing quantity. Steps 3 and 4. Use the demand curve to find the profit maximizing price. This is done by finding the point on the demand curve that corresponds to the profit maximizing quantity and finding the price coordinate of that point. Step 5. Use the average total cost curve to find the average total cost of production. This is done by finding the point on the average total cost curve that corresponds to the profit maximizing quantity and finding the price coordinate of that point. Step 6. The profit earned by the firm is the rectangle formed with the difference between price and the average total cost, with the height and the profit maximizing quantity as the width. This rectangle is the dark shaded area in this figure. If the average total cost is higher than the profit maximizing price, then the firm is earning negative profits. This is illustrated in this figure. The size of the firm's losses in this figure is represented by the area of the unshaded hash-marked rectangle. Note, earning negative profits does not automatically imply that the firm should shut down in the short run.